You heard our conversation yesterday, didn't you? My eldest son and his wife are coming back home for the birth of their child, so I need you to move your belongings out to the yard. Excuse me. You can't have kids anyway, and you don't help with my son's work. So the least you could do is make some room, but I'm paying $20,000 in rent. This is getting too tiring to deal with. I live with my mother-in-law, but now she wants me out of the house because my brother-in-law and his wife are returning. My mother-in-law, brother-in-law, his wife, and my husband. This house is full of problems. I've been trying to keep things running smoothly, but it's becoming a hassle to think about it all. I'm done thinking. Okay, I'll leave, but I can't just put my belongings in the yard. I'll come back later to pick them up. You're leaving? Thank you. That's a big help, my mother-in-law said, ignoring my pleas. I started packing my things and left the house. 7 seconds after stepping out the door, I took out my phone and called a junk removal service. Once I stopped thinking, no one could stop my actions. I'm Florence, a 43-year-old consultant. My husband, George, is also 43 and runs 4 restaurants. We're both 43, and people often assume we've been married a long time and have a kid or two, but we're actually newlyweds. We both lived as workaholics and didn't marry until this age. I had given up on marriage just before turning 43, but a random visit to a bar after work changed my mind. Is this your first time here? He asked. Yes, that's right. I had been curious about it for a while, but it was hard for me to go in alone because the place is so stylish. But I worked hard today, so I decided to go in as a reward to myself. I was relieved to find a counter where it was easy for a loner to spend time. We have many women who come alone, so feel free to visit anytime. My husband George chatted with me with a smile. I sat at the end of the bar. I knew he was just trying to attract a new customer, but for someone like me, who had no friends to eat with at this age, even this kind of service felt nice. Feeling comfortable in George's restaurant, I started visiting often. I always sat at the end of the bar, and it became normal for George to chat with me while I ate. What does an eye consultant do? He asked. I introduce it to companies and do strategic planning. I've worked with restaurants too. Once, I suggested a tablet-based ordering system to reduce labor costs and improve efficiency. Oh, the system that's become common. How much does that cost for a place like this? It would cost about this much, I said, punching numbers into my phone calculator and showing him the screen. No way, that's too much for a small business like mine. George shook his head and hands vigorously. George was curious and always eager to learn from our conversations. He looked for ways to apply new knowledge to his work. Even though it seemed like just a pleasant conversation, I was slowly drawn to his dedication. Likewise, George grew fond of me, seeing that I was hardworking. I'm always busy with work and can't talk much. How about we go out for dinner sometime? Excited about the chance to dine with a restaurateur, I eagerly agreed. I was thrilled to be asked out, but saying something so girlish at nearly 43 would be embarrassing, so let's just leave it at that. My husband didn't just ask me out that one day, he continued to invite me out for meals occasionally. It's natural for adult men and women who frequently dine together to develop a romantic relationship. We started dating, and 3 years later, as we both turned 43, we decided to get married. Feeling shy about being a bride at 43, I asked my husband to skip the wedding ceremony. We just took some photos of us dressed up. After we got married, I moved from my apartment to my husband's house. His house is a 4-story building with a garden and parking, located in a high-end area. The rent is apparently around $22,000. My husband was living there with his mother. Some might think it's unthinkable to live with a mother-in-law right after getting married, but I'm 43, so I didn't mind much. Plus, my mother-in-law is 71, and my father-in-law has passed away, so living together seemed necessary. When my husband suggested living with his mother, I immediately said it was okay, but after starting to live with my mother-in-law, I regretted accepting so quickly. When I moved into my husband's house, besides the bedroom for us, I even got a nice office room for myself. The house seemed too big for just 2 people, with many spare rooms. Once I settled in, I asked my husband, "Why do we need such a big house just for you and your mother?" He replied, "I have a brother 4 years older than me. He left home after college, and we've mostly lost touch. He hasn't been home at all, and it's been a few years since I've heard from him. He's been moving from job to job and place to place. He's the kind of man who might get into trouble and come back to me and Mom, so we decided to rent a bigger house. I think it's a little too big, but now that I'm married and you've moved in, I guess it all worked out. While unboxing my books and arranging them on the shelf, my husband talked about his brother, Arthur, with a smile. It seems Arthur is aimlessly hopping from job to job, but my husband doesn't think badly of him. Don't talk about that kid. What if he really comes back? My mother-in-law appeared at the doorway of what would be my office, seemingly checking on us. It appears she doesn't have a good opinion of him. Unlike my husband, it's understandable for a mother to be cold towards an elder son who shirks his responsibilities. However, I'm worried that my husband and my mother-in-law might clash over his brother someday. Also, I'm not too fond of you either. Mom, come on. We're going to live together now, so stop saying things like that. I'm not saying you should leave. I just need to make things clear from the start, my mother-in-law said as she walked away, her slippers making a padding sound. I'm sorry, I'll talk to her, my husband said. It's okay, I replied. I got a similar talk when we met for the wedding. I'll build a relationship with your mother as we live together, I replied, taking a book from my husband's paused hands and placing it on the shelf. It seems she doesn't like my age. I'm 43, so it's not impossible to have children, but I guess it's a challenging thought. Also, George's elder brother, Arthur, is not married and has no children, so there's a high chance that my mother-in-law won't get to see her grandchildren. That's why she's disappointed and wishes George had married someone younger. To her, Arthur, who doesn't fulfill his role as the eldest son, and I, who can't fulfill my role as a wife, are probably the same in her eyes. I understand her feelings, but I can't change my age. Once the move was finished and our married life began, my mother-in-law's coldness towards me became clear. She ignored me when I spoke and tried to avoid me. It's a bit lonely, but since there's no harassment or physical violence, I guess it's okay for now. I could build a relationship with her over time. My bigger concern is George. Are you okay with your work? I asked. No, it's pretty bad. I need to take action soon, but it's tough to arrange the finances, George said, sitting at the dining table with his head in his hands. I stopped doing the dishes and sat down in front of him to listen. These are tough times. Prices are soaring, expenses are climbing, and customers are tightening their wallets. There's no end in sight. If this keeps up, I might have to close another one of our stores, he continued. About a year into our marriage, the situation at George's restaurants worsened. One of the 4 stores had already closed, and it seemed another might have to shut down too. Seeing George's troubled face made me feel stressed, but my mother-in-law seemed unaffected by these troubles. You're George's wife, but you don't help out at the store. You just do your own job. Can you really say you're fulfilling your role as a wife? My mother-in-law overheard our conversation and hurled insults at me from her seat on the sofa. I wondered what she was thinking, but she has her own perspective. George has been running his own restaurant for nearly 12 years, overcoming various challenges. I believe he'll pull through this time too. You, his wife, shouldn't be making that face. Are you trying to feed into his anxiety and make him fail? What a terrible wife, she shouted again from the living room to the dining room. Her words were filled with spite and venom. I knew she wasn't just trying to fire me up, but she wasn't entirely wrong. I took her words positively, then decided to support George to the fullest, smiling reassuringly at my anxious husband. A year later, just as she said, George managed to turn the situation around and avoid closing the second store. See, I told you. A stupid wife who can't even trust her husband. Don't drag George down, she said. As a side effect, my mother-in-law, who had previously ignored me, started lashing out at me without reservation. The relationship with her might seem to have worsened, but since George's business is doing well, I'll consider it a break-even situation. I thought things were balanced, but it turned out worse for me. George, having stabilized the business and with a bit more money, seemed to get carried away, and I heard rumors about his affair. What is he thinking? If there's extra money, there are surely better ways to spend it. It's strange how bad situations tend to pile up, having seen George's business revenue drop. I know this all too well, but I never thought it would happen to me. George, Arthur called. His girlfriend is pregnant. That's great news. She's a 33-year-old who worked at the same bar as George. They asked something. What? You're being so formal all of a sudden. Arthur is a freelancer, and so is his pregnant girlfriend. With a baby on the way, they're struggling. They asked if they could move into this house and if they could work at your restaurant. I was thinking about how to confront George about the affair when my mother-in-law came into the living room and started talking to him. The conversation was about Arthur, whom I've never met, and I was completely left out as they continued talking. It was a strange scene. She used to dislike Arthur for not fulfilling his role as the eldest son, yet now she was asking George to welcome him. The reason was simple: the grandchild. She had given up hope of seeing a grandchild, but now saw an opportunity and completely changed her stance. She was even planning to offer them a home and jobs. George, who never thought badly of Arthur, had rented this big house for such a time, but the situation has changed, and now I hear this. Isn't it odd to have Arthur and his family move in? I looked at George in the living room from the dining area. He was looking back at me with a clearly troubled expression. Come on, it's a good thing. Arthur is in trouble, and you, George, have the means to help him. Ah, okay, I got it, George sighed, unable to say no to his mother. I had hoped he would stand up to her, but it seems it was just wishful thinking. He kept glancing at me, probably worried about my reaction. The worsening relationship with my mother-in-law, George's affair, and now living with Arthur and his family, the problems just keep piling up. Overwhelmed and not knowing where to start, I decided to abandon things for today and just go to sleep. The next day was a holiday, and probably due to extreme mental fatigue, I slept in until late morning. George was at work, so it was just my mother-in-law and me at home. Dreading what she might say about my sleeping in, I reluctantly headed to the living room. You sure slept in. Must be nice to have such leisure, she said. Bracing myself for her usual nagging about not fulfilling my duties as a wife, I tensed up, ready for her words. However, what she said was much worse than I expected. You heard George and me talking yesterday, right? Arthur and his wife are coming back for a maternity leave visit, so move your stuff out to the yard. Excuse me? Was I still groggy from sleep? Did she really mean I should live in the yard, or was she telling me to leave the house? You can't have kids anyway, and you don't help with George's work, so you should at least make room for Arthur and his family. We have 2 spare rooms left, so if you leave and your office is free, we can have a bedroom and a nursery for Arthur's family and a storage room for their stuff. Don't you think the room count and usage are just perfect? It seems she was indeed telling me to leave to make room for Arthur's family. I'm being kicked out to make room for something that doesn't even seem necessary. Originally, I was allowed to use the office because there were spare rooms. I don't mind losing the office. A bedroom for George and me is enough. Arthur's family can live here without me leaving. Realizing that my mother-in-law now sees no reason for me to be in this house as a wife, since she can see her grandchild, I thought about the $20,000 I was paying in rent. I'm too tired to deal with all this. I decided to clear my mind and rest. Silent with my mother-in-law, the only sound in the living room was the ticking of the clock. Okay, time to leave. After resting my mind, I decided it was too much trouble to worry about what happens to George, my mother-in-law, Arthur's family, and their future. I chose to leave the house. Understood, I'll leave. I can't put all my belongings in the yard, so I'll come back later to pick them up. You're leaving? Thank you, that helps, my mother-in-law said, pleased. Ignoring her, I started packing my things and left the house. 7 seconds after stepping out the door, I took out my phone and called a junk removal service. My decision, made after stopping my overthinking, couldn't be stopped by anyone. Let them all regret this choice later. I left the house and decided to stay at a hotel for a while. I had called the junk removal service, but they needed some time to prepare. This worked out since I wanted some time too. 3 weeks after leaving, I rented an apartment and started living alone. I haven't heard from George since then. He probably thinks I'll come back eventually. The thought of George taking the current situation lightly infuriates me. However, today is the day after his restaurant's day off. I expect a call from George when he visits the restaurant for lunch. Crap, hey, what's going on here? The restaurant is completely empty. Just as I thought, George called. I could explain over the phone, but it would be more efficient if your mom was there too. I'm heading to the house now. Can you come back? You can't open the restaurant anyway, right? I couldn't help but laugh before hanging up, amused by George's reaction. He must be quite shocked. Still chuckling, I started getting ready to leave. When I arrived at the house, my mother-in-law started yelling at me. What on earth is this? The restaurant's fridge, cooking equipment, tables, all the important stuff is gone. You did this, didn't you? Do you think you can get away with this for free? It seems George had explained half of the situation. There was an unfamiliar couple in the living room, apparently Arthur and his wife. They looked confused and anxious, not fully grasping the situation and my mother-in-law's extreme anger. Why would you do such a thing? The restaurant can't operate now, my mother-in-law screamed. It's my restaurant, so there shouldn't be a problem with me starting the closing process or having the items I bought disposed of by a junk removal service, right? I replied. Huh, your restaurant? What are you talking about? My mother-in-law asked. Why don't you explain, George? You haven't told your mom, have you? You remember that I still have the main restaurant and the second branch, and the second one was in a financial crisis, right? Right. Yes, of course. You worked hard to turn it around, changing the tables, chairs, signboard, the restaurant's atmosphere, bringing in new cooking equipment, expanding the menu, and replacing the fridge and freezer to accommodate the new menu, right? Well, about that. Florence actually paid for those expenses. What? What do you mean? Hearing George's words, my mother-in-law looked perplexed. She seemed to be trying hard to understand, but she probably lacked the full information to grasp everything. George continued looking uncomfortable, as if he was holding back from saying more, but it was clear this was going nowhere. I decided to explain everything. Before turning 43, I was single and working in consulting. We didn't have a wedding ceremony, nor did we buy a new house after getting married, so I had saved up quite a bit of money. I lent George $400,000 to help turn around his struggling second restaurant branch. $400,000? But you can't just hand over such a large amount of money to your spouse, right? That's why I decided to buy the rights to the second branch and become its owner. I left most of the management to George, so there wasn't much for me to do as the owner. The only change was that George shifted his focus from the main branch to the second one for its recovery. When George's restaurant was in crisis, I showed my concern alongside him. It was when my mother-in-law yelled at me for not showing enough trust in my husband that I decided to support George to the fullest. My form of support was giving him the money I had saved during my single years. George, is this true? She asked. Yeah, it's true. She said it was okay if I failed and wasted the $400,000. She gave me the money, but since it was such a large amount, if it was going to fail anyway, she suggested becoming the owner. The plan was to pay back the borrowed $400,000 from the restaurant's earnings, but it was simpler for Florence to become the owner and have the restaurant's income go directly to her. It also meant that she could decide whether to close the restaurant or not. It's a lie. Can something like that really happen? My mother-in-law exclaimed. I understand it's hard to believe, hearing this all of a sudden. That's why I brought some evidence. I spread documents like the business license, transfer of rights agreement, and lease agreement on the table, proving that I was the owner of the restaurant. My mother-in-law's face turned red as she confirmed my name on those documents. Why didn't you say anything about this? You always talked about how you believed in George and how the restaurant was recovering, right? Even before we got married. You always encouraged George like that. He felt pressured by your words but tried to live up to your expectations, not wanting to disappoint you as the head of the household. You're pretty cold to people like me and Arthur, who don't fulfill their roles, right? That's why George couldn't tell you he borrowed a large sum of money from me. He could have just told me, she protested. That's why George couldn't speak his mind. Because you get upset easily. People like my mother-in-law often don't realize they're putting pressure on others. They might think it's just a small thing to say, but for the one under pressure, it's a huge burden, not something they can easily talk about. And even if they did speak up, you would likely be disappointed and start complaining. It was essential not to let George's spirit break under her constant jabs, especially when the restaurant was finally turning around. That's why I kept quiet too. But I really wish he had refused when Arthur and his family were coming back. Probably George thought it was work-related and agreed without thinking much. Mom, Florence said, I'm sorry. This situation is my fault for not being decisive enough. If I had managed the restaurant well from the start, Florence wouldn't have had to lend her money. And if I wasn't so weak, I could have told you the truth. If Florence decides to close the restaurant, then that's it, George said. But what about the part-time workers? My mother-in-law asked. Don't worry. In the past 3 weeks, I've already informed everyone about closing the restaurant, and they all understood. For those interested, I've arranged part-time work at other restaurants through my egg consulting contacts. That's a relief. That was my only concern, so everyone was in on this. Florence showed an empty restaurant as a surprise, and everyone kept the closure from me? George, I'm sorry too. I've been pressuring you, and Florence, I'm sorry for everything up to now. I won't tell you to leave again. My mother-in-law apologized, and it seemed as if everything was resolving nicely. But that's a misunderstanding. I'm far from being satisfied, and the discussion is far from over. Let's settle this matter next. What's this? George asked as I placed the divorce papers on the table. He picked them up in shock. What does this mean? Why a divorce? This is supposed to be a reconciliation, right? Don't just assume we've reconciled. You might think it's a secret, but I know about your affair with the part-timer. All the part-time workers knew about it too. That's just a rumor. You can't say things like that without proof. I displayed an image on my smartphone that a part-time worker had sent me and placed it on the table amidst the scattered documents. This is a photo of you entering a hotel. It was taken by one of the part-timers. If you leave the restaurant together and walk towards the nearby hotel district, anyone can take such evidence, not just the police or detectives. Did getting the second branch back on track give you too much confidence? You really got carried away. As the owner of the restaurant, I couldn't do much in the day-to-day operations, but I still visited the restaurant from time to time. That's when the part-time workers told me about George's affair and asked for my help. When I promised to handle it, they provided incredible support. They sent me proof and even kept the closure of the restaurant a secret from him. Wait a minute, closing the second branch and a divorce? What's going to happen to the rent for this place? George asked. The rent for this place? What do you mean? My mother-in-law asked. I haven't mentioned that yet. I've been paying the entire rent of $20,000 a month for this house, I said. Is that also true? She asked George. It's true. When the restaurant's revenue started falling, Florence started paying half of it, but as revenue continued to drop, the amount she had to cover increased. Eventually, she ended up paying it all. $20,000 a month is the same as my salary. So I paid all the rent, and George covered other living expenses like food and utilities. So if George gets divorced and only has the main restaurant left, obviously living here won't be an option anymore. George and my mother-in-law seemed deflated after hearing my words. They slumped as if they had exhausted themselves in a boxing match. Arthur and his wife, now somewhat understanding the situation, hesitantly joined the conversation. What does that mean? We came back here and can't live here, Arthur asked. Wait, Arthur, this is different from what we heard. We thought everything would be fine once we got back home, his wife said. Sorry, Arthur. Right now I don't have the means to help you with a restaurant or a house, I replied. Come on, do something. We're having a baby. At least give me a job, Arthur pleaded. We have enough part-timers. In fact, we need to cut down on staff costs. George will work hard, so just wait a bit longer, I said. That's what I'm talking about. Stop saying things like that. Hey, what about my house and job now? Arthur shouted. George, my mother-in-law, and Arthur started arguing about their future lives. Arthur's wife, whose name I still didn't know, looked uncomfortably out of place. I had delivered the news about the restaurant's closure and the divorce, so my business here was done. I was tired of constantly trying to smooth things over with George and his family, and I refused to live with Arthur and his wife. I didn't care what happened to this house next. They could discuss it amongst themselves. I left the house amid their shouting. After that, having evidence of the affair, I was able to divorce George smoothly. I could have demanded alimony for the affair, but I had a job and didn't need the money. I wanted as little to do with my ex-husband and his family as possible, so I didn't ask for any compensation. After our divorce, my ex-husband George couldn't afford the rent and had to leave the house with his whole family. Financially and emotionally strained, George, who had been taking care of his mother, argued that it was actually Arthur's responsibility as the eldest son. But Arthur, who came back without any money, couldn't take care of her. This led to an ugly fight between the brothers about who should take care of their mother. In the end, with no income, George had to take her in, but this fight ruined the relationship between the brothers. As a result, Arthur and his wife disappeared again, cutting off all contact. Witnessing the brothers dispute over her, the mother-child relationship also deteriorated. Now George and his mother are living together reluctantly in a smaller apartment. It's not as spacious as the previous house, and they have to see each other all the time, but they hardly talk, creating an awkward atmosphere in the house. My actions, prompted by thinking ahead, resulted in the breakdown of a family relationship. After the divorce, I first dealt with closing down the restaurant. It was a bit of a hassle, but as the owner, it was my responsibility. However, the fridge, cooking equipment, tables, and chairs I had removed were fairly new, so I managed to sell them at a good price. Adding just a little more money allowed me to finish the restaurant's closure. Though it was a brief period, Being a restaurant owner and handling its closure was an experience. I believe these experiences will be useful in my IT consulting work someday. I guess work suits me better than marriage. Convinced of this, I continue to work hard today.
I never expected a simple piece of paper to shatter my carefully constructed peace. But there it was, pinned to my front door with a black thumbtack, stark white against the dark wood, fluttering slightly in the autumn breeze. "This isn't over," it read in messy block letters. 3 words that sent ice through my veins and brought my past rushing back like a tidal wave. My name is Lila, and until today I thought I'd finally built the quiet life I'd always dreamed of. A cozy craftsman house in a peaceful neighborhood, a loving partner, and a job at the local library where the biggest drama usually involved overdue books. But that note changed everything. I stood there, keys dangling forgotten in my hand, staring at those 3 words until they burned into my memory. The street behind me was quiet, almost too quiet. Mrs. Peterson's wind chimes next door tinkled softly, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Normal sounds that suddenly felt ominous. My phone buzzed, making me jump. It was Ethan, my partner. "Hey babe, grabbing takeout from Ming's. Want your usual?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, that sounds good." I paused, debating whether to tell him about the note. "How long until you're home?" 20 minutes, tops. "Everything okay?" "You sound weird." "Just tired," I lied, hating myself for it. "See you soon." I pulled the thumbtack out and brought the note inside, laying it on our kitchen counter. The paper was cheap, the kind you'd find in any office supply store. Nothing distinctive about it except for those threatening words and what they represented. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of water. I knew exactly who had left this message. Ryan, Ethan's younger brother, had been acting strange ever since we inherited this house from Ethan's grandmother 6 months ago. He'd made snide comments about how unfair it was, how he and his wife Vanessa deserved it more. But I never thought he'd escalate things like this. The last family dinner replayed in my mind. Ryan's cold stare across the table, Vanessa's sugary sweet voice asking pointed questions about our renovation plans. "It must be nice," she'd said, twirling her wine glass, "having such a beautiful home just given to you." I'd spent years learning to control my reactions, to stay calm in the face of provocation. My past as a martial arts champion taught me that much, at least. But standing in my kitchen, staring at that note, I felt my carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. The sound of a car door slamming made me quickly shove the note into a drawer. Ethan walked in moments later, carrying bags of Chinese food and wearing his usual easy smile. "Got you extra spring rolls," he said, setting everything down and pulling me into a hug. I melted into his embrace, breathing in his familiar scent of coffee and cologne. Should I tell him? Would he believe me over his own brother? Questions churned in my stomach, souring my appetite. "You sure you're okay?" Ethan pulled back, studying my face with concern. "You look pale." The words caught in my throat as headlights swept across our front windows. Car was driving by slowly, too slowly. Through the curtains, I caught a glimpse of Ryan's black SUV. "Actually," I said, making a decision, "there's something we need to talk about." But before I could continue, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Hope you enjoyed my little message." There's more where that came from. The peaceful life I'd built was unraveling, and I had a choice to make. I could stay quiet and hope this would blow over, or I could fight back. As I looked at Ethan's worried face, I realized there really wasn't a choice at all. I'd fought too hard for this life to let anyone take it from me, even if that someone was family. I showed Ethan the note over our cooling Chinese food. His face darkened as he read it, then read it again. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap. "You think Ryan did this?" He finally looked up, his expression a mix of doubt and worry that made my stomach clench. "Who else would it be?" I pushed my untouched spring rolls around with my chopsticks. "You saw how he acted at the reading of the will. How he's been acting ever since." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd grown to recognize. "Ryan can be difficult but threatening notes? That's not his style." "Then whose style is it?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Because someone clearly has a problem with us being in this house. Maybe we should." Ethan was cut off by the sound of tires on gravel. Through our dining room window, I watched Ryan's black SUV pull into our driveway. Again. "Perfect timing," I muttered, standing up. But Ethan caught my wrist. "Let me handle this," he said softly. "He's my brother." That's exactly the problem, I wanted to say. Instead, I nodded and followed him to the door. Ryan and Vanessa stood on our porch like they owned it. Vanessa wore her usual perfectly coordinated outfit and artificial smile, while Ryan lounged against the railing with forced casualness. "Hope we're not interrupting dinner," Vanessa chirped, peering past us into the house. "We were just driving by and thought we'd stop in. For the second time today." "Actually, we were in the middle of something," I started, but Ethan was already stepping aside to let them in. "No problem," he said. "Come on in." I watched them walk into my home, our home, and felt my martial arts training kick in automatically. Analyzing positions, watching movements, staying aware of exits. "Old hobbits die hard." "Love what you've done with Grandma's china cabinet," Vanessa said, running her finger along the antique wood. "Though it's such a shame to change anything. This house has so much history." The way she emphasized that last word made my skin crawl. "What brings you by?" I asked directly, ignoring Ethan's warning glance. Ryan sprawled on our couch, his boots on our coffee table. "Can a guy visit his big brother? Besides, Vanessa and I have been talking about the neighborhood. thinking about maybe moving closer. Closer? The word stuck in my throat. Vanessa nodded, still wandering the room like a realtor sizing up a property. This street has such potential. The right people could really make something of these old houses. I caught the emphasis on right people and felt my hands curl into fists. Ethan must have noticed because he quickly jumped in. That's great, but maybe we could discuss this another time? Lila and I were actually in the middle of an important conversation. Oh. Ryan's eyes locked onto mine. Anything interesting? The note burned in my pocket where I'd stuffed it earlier. I met his stare, remembering years of competition, of knowing exactly when someone was testing my defenses. Just house stuff, I said evenly. Speaking of which, how's that fixer-upper you bought last year coming along? Vanessa's smile flickered. Their investment property had turned into a money pit, and everyone knew it. It's progressing, she said tightly. Though some people just have all the luck, don't they? Getting a move-in ready house just handed to them. Tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Ethan shifted uncomfortably between us, torn between family loyalty and defending our home. Nothing was handed to us, I said quietly. Grandma Carter made her choice. Did she? Ryan stood suddenly. Or did someone help her make it? Ryan, Ethan warned, but his brother was already heading for the door, Vanessa close behind. Thanks for the lovely visit, she called over her shoulder. We should do this more often. After all, we're family. After they left, Ethan and I stood in silence, listening to their car pull away. Chinese food was completely cold now, forgotten on the kitchen counter. Still think Ryan didn't write that note? I asked. Ethan didn't answer, and somehow that hurt more than any threat could. The next morning at the library, I found another note tucked inside the book I'd been reading during my lunch break. You don't belong here. Never did. The handwriting matched the first note perfectly. My hands trembled as I stared at the words. Someone had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. Quiet sanctuary of my workplace suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Earth to Lila. Mia's voice made me jump. She peered over my shoulder, her usual cheerful expression falling as she caught sight of the note. What's that? I quickly folded the paper and shoved it into my pocket. Nothing. Just. Don't you dare say nothing. Mia pulled me into the biography section, away from prying eyes. You've been jumpy all morning, and now this? Talk to me. Before I could respond, the sharp click of heels on hardwood announced Vanessa's arrival. She rounded the corner like she owned the place, designer purse swinging from her arm. Well, isn't this cozy? Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The librarians having their little chat. We're working, I said flatly, turning away. Oh, I'm sure you are. Vanessa's voice dropped lower. Working on how to keep that house, right? Must be exhausting, always looking over your shoulder. My spine stiffened. Mia stepped closer to me, protective. Is there something we can help you find, Vanessa? Mia asked pointedly. Actually, yes. Vanessa pulled out a thick folder. I've been researching property laws. Fascinating stuff. Did you know there are all sorts of ways a will can be questioned? The threat hung in the air between us. I thought of Grandma Carter's final months. How she'd insisted I move in to help care for her while Ryan and Vanessa were too busy with their investment opportunities. The will was perfectly legal, I said quietly. Everything was witnessed and notarized. Legal doesn't always mean right. Vanessa leafed through her folder. For instance, when an elderly woman suddenly changes her will after her grandson's girlfriend moves in, Well, people might wonder about undue influence. My chest tightened. Is that what you're telling people? I'm not telling anyone anything. Her smile turned predatory. Yet? That's enough. Mia's voice was sharp. This is a library, not a courthouse. Take your threats somewhere else. Vanessa's facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something desperate underneath. You think you've won, don't you? Playing the perfect caretaker, the devoted granddaughter-in-law? Some of us had to work for everything we have. Like that falling apart house you can't afford to fix? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Vanessa slammed the folder down on a nearby table, making several patrons jump. You have no idea what it's like, watching everything handed to you while we struggle. That house should have been split equally. Ryan is family. You're just convenient. The old me would have responded differently. Would have shown her exactly how convenient I could be. Instead, I took a slow, steady breath. I think you should leave, I said quietly. Or what? She stepped closer. You'll call security? Have me banned from the public library? That would make a great story for the neighborhood gossips. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably Ethan wondering why I wasn't answering his texts. But I couldn't look away from Vanessa's challenge. You want the truth? I kept my voice low. Grandma Carter left us the house because she knew what you and Ryan would do with it. Flip it for quick cash like every other property you've ruined. She wanted it preserved, not destroyed. Color flooded Vanessa's cheeks. For a moment, I thought she might actually strike me. Instead, she gathered her folder with shaking hands. This isn't over, she hissed, the exact words from the first note. After she stormed out, Mia grabbed my arm. Okay, spill. What's really going on? I pulled out both notes, watching my friend's eyes widen as she read them. Have you told Ethan? He doesn't want to believe his brother could do this. I leaned against the shelves, suddenly exhausted. And maybe he's right. Maybe I'm paranoid. Or maybe, Mia said slowly, you need to stop playing nice and start playing smart. She was right. I'd been trying so hard to leave my past behind, to be the perfect partner and librarian, that I'd forgotten something crucial. Sometimes peace comes at a price. And I knew exactly how to make them pay it. After the confrontation at the library, I spent hours researching Ryan and Vanessa's failed property ventures. Public records told a story of mounting debt and desperate refinancing. But it was a social media notification that made my blood run cold. Someone had tagged Vanessa in photos from my old competition days. They knew. I stared at the images of my younger self on the martial arts circuit, trophies in hand, victory written across my face. The life I'd walked away from was now ammunition in their hands. My phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. Nice roundhouse kick. Shame about that career-ending injury. Or was it? The walls of our cozy living room suddenly felt like they were closing in. I hadn't told Ethan everything about my past, about why I'd really left competitive fighting. Some secrets were better left buried. The front door opened, and I quickly closed the browser. Ethan walked in, looking troubled. Ryan called, he said, dropping his keys on the counter. He wants to meet. Says he has information about the house that might interest us. What kind of information? He wouldn't say. Just that it's important. Ethan wouldn't meet my eyes. Maybe we should hear him out. Like we've heard him out about his last investment opportunity? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. The one that cost you $5,000? That was different. But his shoulders sagged. He's still my brother, Lila. Before I could respond, another text came through. Ask Ethan about the original will. the one from before you moved in. My heart stopped. Ethan, I said carefully, was there another will? His silence was answer enough. Why didn't you tell me? Because it doesn't matter. He finally looked at me. Grandma changed it legally. She wanted you to have this place. But originally it was supposed to go to Ryan, wasn't it? A knock at the door saved him from answering. Through the window, I saw a familiar face I hadn't seen in years. Jax Reynolds, my old training partner. Expecting someone? Ethan asked. I shook my head, moving to open the door. Jax stood there, looking more polished than I remembered in a business suit, but with the same calculating eyes. Long time no see, champ, he said easily. Mind the ficomain. Then tensed beside me. Who's this? An old friend, I said, though friend wasn't exactly the right word. What are you doing here, Jax? He stepped inside, taking in our home with an appraising look. Heard you might need some help. Ryan Carter's been asking questions about you around town. Interesting questions. My stomach dropped. What kind of questions? The kind that make me think he's digging for dirt. Jax's smile was sharp. Good thing I know where all the bodies are buried, right? Then moved closer to me. Is that a threat? Actually, Jax pulled out his business card, Community Development Director. It's an offer of help. Ryan's been trying to push through some questionable permits for his properties. It would be a shame if someone looked too closely at those applications. I studied my old teammate, trying to read his angle. Why would you help me? Let's just say I owe you one. His eyes flickered to my left knee, the injury that ended everything. And I don't like bullies. Another text buzzed in my pocket. Time's running out. Meet tonight or the truth comes out. I looked between Ethan's worried face and Jax's knowing smirk. The past and present were colliding, and I had to choose, keep playing defense or finally strike back. Tell me about those permits, I said to Jax. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. An offense? That was something I knew very well. Lila, Ethan started, but I held up my hand. No more secrets, I said firmly. From any of us. It's time to end this. The weight of my past pressed against my chest, but for the first time since finding that first note, I felt steady. Ready. Let them come. I wasn't looking for a fight when I went for my evening run, but there was Ryan, leaning against my car in the library parking lot after closing. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty lot. Perfect timing for an ambush. Thought you'd want these back, he said, holding up a stack of photographs. Even from several feet away, I recognized them, shots from my competition days, including one from my last match. The one that ended everything. Where did you get those? I kept my voice steady, though my heart raced. Amazing what you can find online. He flipped through them casually. You were quite the champion. Until that unfortunate accident. His smile turned cruel. Or should I say arrangement? My hands curled into fists. What do you want, Ryan? Detrut. He pushed off my car, moving closer. About how you manipulated my grandmother. About the real reason you quit fighting. About everything. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? He pulled out his phone. Because I have some interesting messages here from your old sponsor. He remembers that night very clearly. The memory flashed unbidden. The pressure to throw the fight, the threats, the choice I made that cost me everything. Everything except my integrity. Is that what this is about? I stepped forward. You're trying to blackmail me? I prefer to think of it as negotiation. Ryan's confidence wavered slightly as I moved closer. The house for your secrets. Simple trade. Nothing's ever simple with you. I was close enough now to see the sweat on his forehead. Does Ethan know you're here? Ethan needs to understand what kind of person you really are. That's when I saw Vanessa in her SUV, phone raised, recording everything. Of course, they wanted me to snap to prove I was still violent, still dangerous. But I wasn't that person anymore. Or at least I thought I wasn't. Last chance, Ryan said, dropping the photos at my feet. Sign over the house or everyone learns the truth. I looked at the scattered photos, at my younger self frozen in moments of victory. Then I looked at Ryan, really looked at him, the desperate gleam in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. He was terrified. You want the truth? Kept my voice low, controlled. Here it is. I didn't manipulate your grandmother. She saw through you both long before I came along. She knew about the gambling debts, the failed schemes, the money you borrowed from her savings. Ryan's face paled. That's a lie. Is it? Should we ask Jax about those permit applications? The ones with forged signatures? He lunged forward, grabbing my arm. You don't know anything. Years of training kicked in automatically. One fluid movement and Ryan was on the ground, my knee pressed firmly between his shoulder blades. I heard Vanessa scream, car doors slamming. I know everything, I said quietly, holding him down with minimal effort. Every debt, every scheme, every lie. Your grandmother knew too. That's why she changed her will. Let him go. Vanessa was running towards us, phone still recording. You're proving everything we said about you. I released Ryan and stepped back, keeping my stance ready. He scrambled up, face red with rage and humiliation. You're done, he spat. When Ethan sees this. When I see what? We all turned. Ethan stood at the edge of the lot, expression unreadable. Behind him was Jax, holding a thick folder. Perfect timing, Jax said, smiling. I was just coming to discuss those permit applications with Ryan. And look, we have witnesses. Color drained from Ryan's face. Vanessa's phone lowered slowly. Ethan, Ryan started, but his brother held up a hand. I saw everything, he said quietly. And I heard everything. He moved to stand beside me, his hand finding mine. It's over, Ryan. All of it. Choice I'd made years ago to walk away rather than compromise my principles had cost me a career. But standing there, feeling Ethan's support, seeing Ryan and Vanessa's schemes crumbling, I knew I'd make the same choice again. Sometimes the biggest victories come from knowing when not to fight. But sometimes you have to show them exactly what you're capable of. Carter family gathering felt more like a powder keg waiting to explode. I watched from our kitchen as relatives filled the backyard, their cheerful conversations masking the tension underneath. Ethan squeezed my hand, a silent reminder that we had a plan. But plans have a way of falling apart. Ready? He asked, checking his phone where Jax's message waited. Documents in hand. On my way. I nodded, though my stomach churned. After the parking lot incident, Ryan and Vanessa had gone suspiciously quiet. Too quiet. Well, isn't this cozy? Vanessa's voice cut through the crowd as she and Ryan approached. She carried a thick manila envelope that made my skin crawl. Family all together, just like old times. Ryan wouldn't meet our eyes, but something in his stance set off warning bells in my head. He looked satisfied, like someone who knew they'd already won. Before everyone sits down, Vanessa announced loudly, we have something to share. She pulled documents from her envelope. Some interesting information about dear Lila's past. The chatter died down. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. Vanessa, Ethan started, but she spoke over him. Did you know your sweet librarian was involved in illegal betting? That she took money to throw fights? She smiled coldly. We have proof. My chest tightened. That's not. And that's not all, Ryan finally spoke, his voice carrying across the yard. We found something else. About Grandma's last days. Ethan stiffened beside me. This wasn't part of the plan. Turns out, Ryan continued, there were some interesting withdrawals from her accounts. Large ones. Right around the time Lila moved in to help care for her. The accusations hung in the air like poison. I saw doubt creep into the relatives' faces, heard their whispers. Show them the rest, Vanessa urged her husband, pulling out more papers. About how she manipulated. Stop. Ethan's voice cut through the tension. Just stop. Why? Ryan challenged. Afraid of the truth? About how your girlfriend stole what should have been mine. I waited for Ethan to defend me, to reveal what we knew about Ryan's schemes. Instead, he hesitated just for a moment. But that moment was enough. Ethan, I whispered. He looked between me and his brother, torn. I need to see those documents. The ground seemed to shift under my feet. After everything, after the parking lot, after all our planning, he still doubted me? You don't need to see anything, I said quietly. You just need to trust me. But he was already reaching for the papers Vanessa held out triumphantly. The same papers we'd planned to expose as forgeries when Jax arrived. My phone buzzed. Accident on May. Delayed 20 minutes. Hold them off. Too late. Oh my, Vanessa gasped theatrically as she read over Ethan's shoulder. These bank records. Lila, how could you? The documents were lies. I knew they were lies. But watching Ethan's face change as he read them, seeing the doubt creep in despite everything we'd been through. I can explain, I started, but the words felt hollow. How do you explain away carefully crafted lies when the truth sounds just as unbelievable? Ryan moved closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear. You should have taken the deal. Now you lose everything. I looked around at the judging faces, at Ethan still reading those poison papers, at the home I'd fought so hard to protect. Everything I'd built, everything I'd changed about myself, crumbling because of carefully constructed lies. I trusted you, Ethan finally said, his voice breaking. After everything with Ryan, I chose you. You still can, I whispered. Just wait. For what? Ryan interrupted. More lies? More manipulation? Crowd had grown silent, watching the drama unfold. I saw phones recording, faces I'd grown to love now twisted with suspicion and judgment. In that moment, I realized something terrible. Sometimes the truth doesn't matter. Sometimes the story people want to believe is stronger than reality. I turned and walked away, leaving behind the whispers, the accusations, and the man I loved still holding papers that told lies about me. Sometimes walking away isn't surrender, it's survival. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Because while they were all focused on destroying my reputation, they'd forgotten something crucial. I hadn't survived this long by playing nice. I was halfway to my car when Jax's voice cut through the murmur of the gathering. Those are interesting documents you've got there, Ryan. Mind if I take a look? Crowd parted as Jax strode through, briefcase in hand, looking more like a prosecutor than a community development director. I turned back, watching Ryan's confident smirk falter. This is a private family matter, Vanessa said quickly, trying to gather the papers. Oh, I think it's very public. Jax opened his briefcase. Especially considering these forged permit applications with Ryan's signature. And these bank records showing mysterious deposits right after Grandma Carter's jewelry went missing. The whispers shifted. I saw heads turning, expressions changing. "That's ridiculous," Ryan sputtered. "You can't prove." "Actually, I can." Jax pulled out more documents. "See, when you started digging into Lila's past, you caught the attention of some interesting people. People who remembered your gambling debts, Ryan. People who kept very detailed records." Finn stepped forward, the false documents forgotten in his hands. "What gambling debts?" "Tell them, Ryan," I said quietly. "Tell them about the real reason you need this house so badly." Ryan's face had gone pale. Vanessa grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "Don't say anything. They're bluffing." "Am I?" Jax turned to the crowd. "Mrs. Peterson, remember when your wedding rings disappeared during that dinner party? The one where Ryan helped clean up?" The elderly neighbor gasped, hands flying to her chest. "That's enough." Ryan lunged forward, but I was ready. One swift movement and he was on his knees, arm locked behind him, not hurting, just contained. Years of training made it look effortless. "The truth, Ryan," I said firmly. "All of it. Now." "You don't understand," he gasped. "The debts. They were going to hurt Vanessa. I had to do something." "So you stole from your own grandmother?" Finn's voice cracked. "From our neighbors? I was going to pay it back." Ryan struggled against my hold. "Once we got the house, we could sell it, start fresh." "But you," he glared at me, "you ruined everything." "No, Ryan." I released him carefully. "You did that yourself." Vanessa suddenly laughed, a sharp, desperate sound. "You want the truth? Fine. We're broke. Worse than broke. Every property we bought is worthless. Every investment failed. And there you were, living in our house, playing happy families." "It was never your house," a new voice said. We all turned to see Mia holding up her phone. "And I have Grandma Carter's last video message to prove it." The screen showed the elderly woman in her hospital bed, clear-eyed and determined. "I'm leaving the house to Ethan and Lila because they love it like I do. They'll preserve it, not sell it for quick cash like Ryan wants. I know about the stealing, the gambling. I'm not angry, just disappointed. The house needs protectors, not profiteers." Silence fell over the gathering. Ryan slumped, defeated. Vanessa's perfect mask cracked, tears streaming down her face. "I trusted you," Ethan said to his brother. "Even when the evidence was right in front of me, I wanted to believe in you." "I never meant." Ryan stopped, looking lost. "I didn't know how to ask for help." "You still could," I said softly. "But it starts with the truth. All of it." Ryan looked at me, then at Jax's documents, then at his wife. Something shifted in his expression, resignation, maybe, or relief. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." As Ryan began to speak, confessing everything, I felt Ethan's hand slip into mine. An apology, an acknowledgement, a promise. Sometimes victory isn't about winning the fight. Sometimes it's about giving your opponent the chance to surrender with dignity, to choose truth over pride. I'd learned that lesson the hard way years ago in the ring. Now, watching Ryan finally face his demons, I realized that maybe some fights are won not by striking, but by standing firm until the truth has nowhere else to hide. The house would stay ours, but more importantly, the truth would stay too, all of it, mine and Ryan's both. 'Cause sometimes the only way forward is to stop running from your past and learn to walk with it instead. 6 months after the confrontation, I found another note in our mailbox. My hands didn't shake this time as I opened it. though my heart skipped when I recognized Ryan's handwriting. "We're in Seattle now," it read. "Starting over. Really starting over. Thank you for not pressing charges. For giving us a chance to make things right." I sat on our porch swing, the same spot where this all began, and finished reading. Ryan had entered rehab for his gambling addiction. Vanessa was working at a real estate firm, legitimately this time. They were in therapy, both together and separately. "Everything okay?" Ethan appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his face. "Old Hobbits die Hard. Your brother wrote." I handed him the letter. "They're doing better." He read in silence, then settled beside me on the swing. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of Mrs. Peterson's roses. She'd finally forgiven us for all the drama after Ryan returned her wedding rings, along with a heartfelt apology. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked quietly. "Showing mercy instead of pressing charges?" I thought about that moment after Ryan's confession when everyone expected me to demand justice, to make them pay for every threat, every lie. Instead, I'd offered a choice: face the consequences legally or take the chance to rebuild their lives somewhere else. "No," I said finally. "Some fights aren't worth winning if the victory costs too much." Ethan nodded, understanding what I meant. His relationship with Ryan was different now, cautious, fragile, but healing. Like a broken bone that needed time to mend properly. "Jax called today," he mentioned, changing the subject. "The community center wants you to teach self-defense classes. Said something about putting your skills to better use than throwing his brother-in-law around parking lots." I laughed, surprising myself. The sound echoed across our front yard, where neighborhood kids now played freely, no longer afraid of the scary librarian with the mysterious past. "Maybe I will," I mused. "It might be time to stop hiding who I am." "You never had to hide," Ethan said softly. "I'm sorry I ever made you feel like you did." Before I could respond, a car pulled into our driveway. Mia stepped out, carrying a folder of library event plans, while Jax followed with takeout bags. "Family dinner?" Mia called out, waving the folder. "We can plan the summer reading program while we eat." Family. The words settled warmly in my chest. Not just Ethan now, but Mia and Jax too. Even Mrs. Peterson, who'd taken to leaving her famous apple pies on our porch every Sunday. As we moved inside, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. Not just the librarian, not just the fighter, but something in between. Something whole. The house creaked softly around us, familiar and welcoming. Grandma Carter would have loved this, I thought. Not just preserving the building, but filling it with new life, new memories. Later that night, after our friends had left, I found one last surprise in Ryan's letter. A small key taped to the bottom of the page. "Found this in our things," his postscript read. "It belongs to Grandma's old jewelry box. The real one, not the decoy she kept on her dresser. Maybe you'll have better luck finding it than we did." I showed Ethan, watching his eyes light up with recognition. "The attic," he said. She always told us the house had secrets, but only for those patient enough to discover them properly. Tomorrow we'd climb into the attic and search for that hidden box. Tomorrow we'd add another chapter to this house's story. But for now, I was content to sit with Ethan, listening to our home's quiet breathing, feeling the perfect balance between my past and present. The last light of day filtered through our windows, casting long shadows that looked almost like they were dancing. Somewhere in Seattle, Ryan and Vanessa were building a new life. Here, in this house that had seen both battle and peace, we were building something too. Not just a home, but a testament to the fact that sometimes the strongest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from helping them find their way back to themselves.
I used my passion for baking to my advantage, and was hired by the confectionery firm I currently work for. I started off working at one of the stores, but I was moved to the head office last summer, where I currently work in the accounting division. Hold on, this is weird. The figures don't add up. Since I'm the kind of person who works best on my feet, spending all day at a computer doing math is really difficult for me. I've only had time to bake on the weekends since I started this job. Another cause of stress for me has been the significant cutback in the amount of time I spend on my pastime. One more thing. I and everyone else in the accounting department are always stressed out by a certain someone. Hey George, there were errors in the document you created once more. Double check your work before you submit it, yelled Keith, my supervisor, just now. It's me who receives the reprimands for these errors. I'm sorry. Are you able to identify the errors? I'll check it over and submit it again. Keith responded to my question by saying, "Come on. Don't go around asking people about it. Look for it on your own. You realize you're not a child." With his hands on his hips and a half smile of incredulity, he stated this. He could simply tell me if he knows there are errors, but he chooses not to. He likes this power play, of course. Even though he only ever smokes or stamps papers, he is always criticizing his coworkers for small errors. I apologize. By the end of the day, I will locate it. He gets upset if we disagree, so the accounting department coworkers keep quiet. Keith takes advantage of that to become even more controlling. Everyone now experiences chronic stress as a result of this destructive cycle. Errors, where might they be? I checked to be sure Keith was gone, then muttered to myself as I looked for the errors he had pointed out. He would have another tantrum if I didn't put down what I was doing and concentrate on this. In this setting, it had become our responsibility as subordinates to keep him happy, and that had become our main concern. We would be depressed if we didn't at least whisper grumbles to ourselves. The mood in the accounting department was at its worst as a result. Although the material appeared to be acceptable, Keith's approval stamp was clearly visible on the PDF he returned. Only because Keith himself had examined the material should the stamp have been present. Is that a typo? After giving it some thought, I proofread the document. Despite going over it multiple times, nothing appeared to be incorrect. Oh, we're at it once more. This was not the first time such an incident has occurred. He wouldn't say what the error was, and once it was found, there wouldn't be anything wrong to find. It was a situation that had happened several times previously. Keith was engaging in what was essentially falsification. Well, such a prickly fellow. I had a senior colleague look it over just to be sure, but once more, there were no errors. I returned it to Keith exactly as it was, with no modifications. He causes needless suffering to his subordinates in this way. He discloses trivial or even non-existent errors to his superiors and claims credit for fixing them. To put it another way, his work consists entirely on pointing fingers and fabricating accomplishments. Documents had recently been changed and portions of data erased. Some have attempted to obtain proof and inform the superiors about him, but they appeared hesitant out of concern for reprisals. I continued to work as hard as I could under such circumstances. Our accounting department, which was in charge of creating the financial reports, was in a panic as the shareholders' meeting drew near. Because of this, the environment was more tense than usual, and everyone's threshold for rage was considerably lower than it was for Keith, who was carefree. We won't make it again, I guess. In a few cases, the numbers simply didn't add up, regardless of how many times I recalculated. There was a $50,000 sum that could not be explained. If my memory serves me well, the project paperwork for this project bore the approval seals of both George and Keith. This meant that Keith and I were in charge of the project, but I hadn't really done anything of it. I found it odd because he usually assigned me all of the work, but I never imagined Keith was in charge of this project, right? I went over to Keith after printing out the materials I needed to explain. What are you looking for? He glared at me with an irritated expression. The figures don't add up. no matter how many times I recalculate. Additionally, we're discussing a substantial amount of $50,000. I'd assumed you would know something, but I even questioned my senior accounting department colleagues. Keith appeared to get my point as he quickly perused the stapled pages. He wrinkled his brows for a time, then tossed the papers back on the desk. I'm not sure whether you have time for this. Simply finish your assignment. In my mind, I quietly cursed him because I believed that was what he ought to be doing. However, we can't disregard a $50,000 mystery. Stop talking. It's either a calculating error or a misunderstanding on your part. He refused to look into it further and kept to that stance regardless of what I said. It's extremely suspicious when someone is thus obstinately obstructive. I said in a low voice, "All right, fine," and went back to my desk. I was aware that we were currently overworked, but because Keith was not going to take any action, I made the subtle decision to look into the situation myself. The possibility that Keith was embezzling money was becoming clear. I gathered the required paperwork once more and returned to his desk. Are you persistent, Keith? This time, what is it? As if to suggest, figure out why I'm here yourself. I handed him the paperwork in silence. I informed you that you made a calculation error. Where is the error exactly? Please draw attention to it. My blunt inquiry caught Keith off guard, and he became increasingly agitated. On the other hand, I maintained my composure and kept answering firmly. Keith refused to acknowledge anything in spite of all of this proof. Therefore, if you're saying that there's an error, kindly point it out to me. Or is this merely a charge? You little. His leg bounced uneasily, and he appeared annoyed. I guess he was growing tired of my asking the same questions over and over. You're slow at your job, to start. That isn't pertinent at the moment, is it? You make too many errors. In particular, where are the errors? Point them out, please. I saw a drop of perspiration trickle down Keith's brow. He was speaking incoherently more and more. Even with the facts I had, it was a gamble, but it appeared that I was correct. To be honest, I fail to see why you are needed by this company. As he spoke, Keith swallowed his rage and attempted a bitter smile, but I simply replied, "What a coincidence. I have the same sentiments. I also fail to see why the organization needs you." You little. What did you say? At what I said, Keith erupted in anger. His smirk soon gave way to a look of rage as he yelled so loudly that his voice could be heard throughout the workplace. You've been fired. Never again reveal your face here. The abrupt announcement of my termination caught me off guard. He went farther than I thought he would. He continued to spit forth a barrage of insults while I stood there wide-eyed, even in his rage. Keith had gone absolutely crazy and was now a ferocious beast. I left the workplace after apologizing to my senior colleagues for my inability to defuse the situation. I pulled out my phone and called someone as I was walking down the corridor. Hey, I want you to proceed with that issue we talked about earlier. The other end's voice was one of satisfaction. Yes, that's all. Thank you. After hanging up, I returned it to my pocket. I couldn't help but smile as I stood in the dark corridor. As planned, the shareholders' meeting took place a few days later. I hadn't shown up in the accounting department since I was fired, but it appeared that the preparations were finished on schedule. I surprisingly ran into Keith as I walked inside the melancholy location. Oh, hi there. You're here, but why? This isn't where you belong. What brought you here? Go now. As soon as he saw me, he began insulting me, but today I didn't bother to answer. I simply laughed casually and dismissed him. Keith, you're speaking too loudly. There stood a tall, graying-haired man. Scott was returning today after spending the last few weeks in the hospital for medical testing. He was the department head and my boss, as well as Keith's. You're right. I said, I was fired. Scott, I already fired this guy. Keep quiet, I said. Scott interrupted Keith, who flinched back, his expression sad. but he kept glaring at me, so it was obvious he still didn't like that I was here. It's almost time now. Should we leave? Yes, I said, and Scott and I made our way to the best seats in the house, which were set aside for the executives and significant stockholders. Why are you sitting there, George? Are you even aware of who owns the seat? Keith continued to yell after being repeatedly warned to stop. Keith, don't you know? The introductory remarks began as Scott, apparently impatient, proceeded to explain. Scott paused his speech and looked at the presenter. I did as he said. At last, even Keith sat down and grudgingly took a seat. Mr. Kelly, the president, stepped up to the stage and started discussing the company's current state, management, and future goals. I could feel Keith's eyes on me all the time during the process. He appeared to have turned pallid. The reports end there. The question and answer period will now begin. Please raise your hand if you have any queries. No hands were raised. The stockholders were too busy going over their materials. Yet, this is my chance. Excuse me, may I ask a question? I raised my hand and looked straight at Mr. Kelly, having previously prepared my questions. I caught a glimpse of Keith squirming out of the corner of my eye. Go ahead. I'm grateful. Concerning the financial statements of the business. Here, I went forward and gave Mr. Kelly the materials. These were the resources I had gathered while looking into Keith. According to this document, there appeared to be approximately $50,000 in unaccounted for expenses. Could you elaborate on the purpose of this money? I appreciate your inquiry. Mr. Kelly turned to Keith and said, I will have Keith, the head of the accounting department, respond to this. Keith jumped to his feet, shaky, and yelled, Why is someone who was dismissed asking questions like this? Furthermore, why are you seated there at all? Keith was making a spectacle rather than responding to the question, possibly because his wrongdoing had been revealed at the shareholders' meeting. A person with your level of incompetence has no place here. You don't belong here. I told you to go. Like that day, Keith had lost all self-control. Normally polite, Scott loudly stepped in to stop him. Keith remained still for a single word, possibly taken aback by his customary manner. It is quite reasonable for him to be present at the shareholders' meeting on this side, no less. Nothing is wrong with it. Keith's expression became blank in bewilderment as he listened to Scott's statements. He fidgeted awkwardly with shame, as if he had regained some of his composure. Keith, take a look at this. Having said that, I produced a copy of a document, a proxy statement, to Keith. When Keith understood what it meant, he started to shake once more. He must have realized who he had betrayed and the consequences. According to the proxy statement, his older brother owns over 60% of the shares, making him the primary shareholder. On his behalf, he is attending. Yes, this was a very unpleasant truth for Keith, and he fell back in his chair when he heard it. He uttered only barely audible moans, as if unable to speak. This company's president is my father, Richard Kelly. Earlier, he was the one on stage telling the stockholders what was going on. My father assumed control after my grandfather, the founder, passed away. The biggest stockholder, my older brother Samuel, is employed in a totally unrelated field to confectionery. What I'm going to inherit is the cake shop. My brother was a senior in high school while I was in second grade. My father started talking to him about the future about the time he was accepted to college. Yes, it's still a long way off, but I'd like to entrust it to you as the eldest son. My brother, obviously distressed by my father's severe tone, scratched the back of his head. Playing loudly with a dual-screen square handheld game console next to them, I was just 8 years old at the time and didn't understand the scenario. Dad, you know I'm not really a fan of cakes, right? My brother had less of a sweet tooth, which was a sharp contrast to my love of baking and sweets. In hindsight, expecting him to take over a bakery shop seemed rather harsh. Yes, your mother informed me. Then spare me, please. I won't be able to dedicate myself to running a store that sells something I dislike. Yes, it is accurate. However, the store was still a little family-owned enterprise at the time. Sales, however, were rising steadily. Making tasty and reasonably priced candies that even young children could purchase with their pocket money was the shop's credo. This strategy had been sufficiently well-liked locally to be highlighted in local publications. My brother made the decision to invest in the store and form it as a corporation when I was a high school student. He decided to do that rather than take over the company. Sales of the pastries have increased even further since then. Our current position is the result of the company's steady growth. Hey, my brother is expecting his second child soon and can't leave his wife's side, which is why I'm here on his behalf. Keith's face paled even more when I told him why I was there. He remained sitting and gestured at me with a quivering finger. But the most significant one is your brother. It doesn't alter the fact that the business doesn't need you. What are you saying, Keith? Once again losing his temper, Keith received a stern reprimand from Scott. Keith's countenance, which I had seen on numerous occasions, became blank. He's the second son of Mr. Kelly and the next president of this company. What? It was unavoidable, yet it had become an unexpected announcement. As Scott said, it's still some time away, but I am set to take over from my father as president. The announcement that I would be taking over as vice president was meant to be made during the shareholders' meeting, but things have gone awry. Not at all. You, the incoming president? Keith appeared to lose focus as he heard Scott's statements. He didn't want to believe it, or rather, he couldn't believe it. How could he simply accept that the president's son was the subordinate he had worked so hard to discredit? In contrast to my brother, who disliked sweets, I enjoyed creating and eating them. I grew up eating cakes from the shop, so I was well aware of how good they were. My goal was for this taste to become even more popular nationwide. That's how I started thinking at one point. In order to produce sweets that could be purchased with pocket money, I not only manufactured pre-made cakes, but also developed my own recipes. I concentrated on cutting expenses as much as I could. How to make them appear as nice as they tasted was the difficult part. Beyond appearances, creating new creations brought me a lot of satisfaction. The procedure seemed almost like a puzzle game when these two guidelines were kept in mind. In addition to cutting expenses, I also wanted to make sure the ingredients were safe. It was difficult to source ingredients at a low cost while maintaining excellent quality, but we were able to do so because of our established connections with nearby farms and the new alliances we formed. The company grew as a result of these efforts. For me, it was crucial to value this business, which had developed from the cake shop my grandpa had started. I wanted to closely monitor the money flow because of this. Since I was already slated to become vice president, I was in the accounting division. I believe it was the right decision even if my original goal was different because I ended up exposing someone like Keith. We will now go on to the Q&A. The results of the study into this issue will be presented by George, the vice president. The shareholders' meeting continued after my father's remarks. Yes, Keith embezzled the $50,000 that couldn't be explained, I declared. The room was alive with sound as I spoke. The man at the heart of the dispute, Keith, remained hunched over in silence. He conspired to fabricate invoices with a supplier. Company funds were used to pay these invoices, and the supplier received a portion of the earnings. When we carefully examined the invoices, we discovered that Keith's approval stamp appeared on bills for goods that were never delivered. The supplier's representative acknowledged the misconduct when questioned. In order to prevent Keith and the other persons involved from escaping, my father and I agreed to report the damage to the police on the company's behalf. In front of the board members and shareholders, I revealed Keith's wrongdoing. With a dejected expression, he fell to his knees as everything became clear. I heard, "This is the police," at that very moment. Keith, you have an arrest warrant. Keith was taken away by the police officers who had come at the shareholders' meeting. He allowed himself to be led away without protest. My father and I bowed to the stockholders a few minutes after the room had subsided. We were expressing regret for an employee's misbehavior. To formally look into the degree of the damages, we plan to collaborate closely with the police. The goal is to get Keith to pay back as much of the losses as he can, even though not all of them may be recouped. George was the first to discover the scam. I think he is qualified to lead this organization as vice president and then president because of his unwavering commitment to enforcing the law. The room erupted in cheers when Mr. Kelly said this. Being accepted instead of disliked was comforting. Let's listen to the new vice president's speech now. Although I did approach the microphone, however, I didn't feel anxious. Giving a speech didn't feel all that frightening, maybe because I had been much more nervous dealing with Keith. My grandfather started this business as a cake shop. It was soon after the war, when food was in low supply and the wounds of the conflict were still evident. My grandfather started baking sweet cakes to lift the spirits of the kids when he noticed their grins waning. He gained experience and expertise in cake decorating as the number of kids visiting for goodies steadily grew. It all began when he used his skills to open a tiny stall. My father, the current president, inherited my grandfather's wish to preserve the children's smiles with cakes, and I now wish to continue that tradition with him. The environment surrounding children and the need for sweets have undergone tremendous shift during the post-war era. The state of the economy has changed and patterns have emerged. However, there is one thing that hasn't changed. Children smiles when they eat sweets. I want to make sure that priceless joy never fades. I need the help of all of our workers and shareholders to do this. The crowd erupted in cheers once more as I bowed and concluded my remarks. My father gave me a really emotional look and said, "George, you've grown up so well." I then quit the accounting division and started working mostly as my father's assistant at meetings, on business travels, and when he wanted to greet people. Busy days continued, with a lot of running around. Despite everything, I always made sure to monitor the company's internal operations. I was often in the product development division. This feels less like work and more like a continuation of my previous pastime. It tastes good, but maybe a little too sour. I eventually moved to the side of judging other people's cakes. Children may find it unpleasant if the sourness is too intense. Although I appreciate the request, I do feel a little alone. Even asking my dad if I can work in the development department more often is something I'm considering. This size could present a choking hazard. Could you perhaps add some holes or make it smaller? I was concerned that my incessant criticism could irritate people, but the development department staff assured me that it was beneficial. I've known a few people in this department since I was a young child. Fortunately, everyone trusted my opinions, maybe because I've been eating the company's pastries since I was a child. Are you only here to taste the cakes, George? I was mocked by Edward, the development department director, who has known me since I was a young child. Obviously not. I'm here to observe the progress of the development project. Everything is fine. Additionally, your exact counsel is always quite beneficial. Knowing that I wasn't merely circling about was a relief. I used to work in the accounting department, and I occasionally showed my face there as well. The department head is now one of my seniors who always looked out for me. Under Scott's tutelage, he appears to be settling into his new role. He'll likely succeed even in this new managerial role because he's good at taking care of others. Oh, Mr. Kelly, good afternoon. Good afternoon, indeed. The accounting section has a more upbeat vibe than it did previously. It's most likely because the problematic person who threw tantrums, made up mistakes, and tossed work on others is no longer there. Since then, working has been considerably simpler. Above all, we don't get yelled at, and we can communicate with our managers more readily. The office erupted in laughter when one of the coworkers mentioned that. Yes, it's a positive result if they can now laugh about what happened in the past. Sincerely, I'm relieved they weren't traumatized. I was happy that I hadn't made a bad choice. During a break on another day, I decided to stop by one of our stores. Originally a tiny cabin that my grandfather constructed by hand, this was our first store and has undergone multiple renovations. Hello. A bell rang, and a parent and child stepped through the manual door. A young child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, appeared to be thrilled by the pastries. More customers soon arrived. As the kids selected which cakes to purchase, they were all grinning broadly. Some of them filled their small baskets with so many cakes that they appeared to be about to overflow. Although it was wonderful to watch, I questioned whether their mothers would discipline them for grabbing so many. Funny, this reminds me of the past. We can purchase as many cakes as we choose now that we are grown-ups. They refer to that as a shopping binge. The exhilaration of being asked to choose only one favorite dessert, whether it was the same cake I always had or the risk of trying something else, was what I enjoyed most though. I was the kind of person who was always up for trying something new. Finding different kinds of cakes was like embarking on a true journey. The children who are currently selecting cakes in the supermarket are undoubtedly experiencing the same thrill. There are a lot of smiles here because of this. It's time to return to work and give it my all then. My goal is to preserve those smiles and pass them on to the following generation. Keeping that in mind, I started working on my next assignment.
I've always dreamed of a perfect family. Growing up in foster care in Austin, Texas, I felt isolated and alone, yearning for something stable and loving. I envisioned a family where I'd find joy and security, a loving husband, delightful children, and a home filled with warmth. When David, a man I met through mutual friends, proposed to me, I thought my dream was finally coming true. David was 34 years old, 2 years older than me. He had a stable job in logistics, and I, at 32, worked as a marketing manager at a tech company. Our relationship seemed perfect. David was charming, and we both wanted the same things out of life. But after we married, everything started to unravel. The first few months of our marriage were idyllic. However, it didn't take long for David's true colors to show. He became increasingly demanding and lazy. Instead of contributing to our household, he began to boss me around. "Sarah, make dinner now," he'd say as soon as I got home from work. "Alice and Mom are starving." His sister Alice, who was 26 years old, and his mother both lived with us. Neither of them lifted a finger around the house. David eventually quit his job in logistics, claiming that he had a falling out with his boss and needed to focus on his family obligations. This left me to handle everything. I worked hard every day, coming home to cook, clean, and take care of all the household responsibilities. Despite the long hours at my marketing job, I felt like I was working double time, just to keep up with everything David, Alice, and his mother left undone. One day, I received an unexpected visit from David's logistics department manager. He looked exhausted as he shared some troubling news about David. Apparently, David's poor work ethic had caused significant issues. He'd often leave work unfinished and pass on his overtime to timid colleagues. When his manager confronted him, David got angry and accused the management of being heartless. His excuse for leaving work early was always about his family, claiming he needed to tend to his frail mother and sister. The manager informed me that David's behavior was a major problem in the department. He used his family situation as an excuse to avoid his responsibilities, which was causing a lot of stress for his colleagues. They were overburdened and mentally exhausted. Eventually, when David's manager insisted he finish his work properly, David quit on the spot, which led to a lot of trouble for his coworkers. I felt a mix of relief and guilt after hearing this. I knew David wasn't a good worker, but hearing it from his manager made it clearer. I apologized profusely for the trouble David had caused, and the manager assured me that it wasn't my fault. He mentioned that David had quit without even talking to me about his decision. I was already overwhelmed with managing all the household chores and finances alone, while David, Alice,
and his mother continued to contribute nothing. David claimed he was working part-time at a local cafe, but his real focus was on his sister Alice's demands. Alice, who had recently turned 26, frequently asked for money from David. With no other sources of income, David handed her what he could. Meanwhile, his mother took money from my wallet without asking, which I discovered when I went to buy groceries. One evening, I met Tom, a 27-year-old barista and student, when he brought a very drunk Alice home. Tom seemed polite and honest. He shared that Alice had lied to him about her job and character, which was unsettling to hear. Over time, Tom and I started talking more, and he became a friend. As things continued to deteriorate at home, David announced he wanted to give his family my savings, which amounted to $50,000, to cover their expenses. He threatened that if I refused, he'd divorce me. I had been saving this money for our future, but David's selfishness was pushing me to my limits. I decided to confront the situation head-on. I had already prepared divorce papers, knowing that David's demands would eventually reach this breaking point. I handed him the papers, and he signed them without hesitation. I left David, Alice, and his mother behind and returned to my foster father's home. He had always been a strong pillar of support for me, and I needed that stability now more than ever. Life at my foster father's house was a mix of relief and uncertainty. I felt safe there, but the weight of my recent decisions and the strain of rebuilding was daunting. I knew that turning my life around would require more than just leaving David. It would involve facing the mess he'd left behind and confronting the people who had contributed to my misery. One day, as I was organizing my things, I received a call from Tom. He had heard about the trouble I'd been through and wanted to check in. He was working as a barista and studying part-time, but he was kind enough to offer a listening ear. When he asked how things were going, I couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration and sadness. I explained how David had handed over $50,000 of our savings to his family and left me in financial ruin. Tom listened intently. "You know, I've seen Alice around," he said, "and she's not the sweet girl she pretends to be. She's quite manipulative, and it sounds like David was enabling her." His words resonated with me. David had always made excuses for Alice's behavior, insisting she was in a tough spot. Yet, it became clear that David had been complicit in her demands for money. His job at the cafe barely brought in any income, leaving him with little to contribute. As I was settling into my new routine, my foster father's influence began to show its impact. He had always been well-connected and wealthy, and his support was instrumental in helping me regain my footing. Despite this, the emotional and financial toll of David's actions remained heavy on my shoulders. Then one evening, I had a surprising encounter. I walked into a local bar, a place Tom had recommended, hoping for a change of scenery. To my astonishment, Tom was there, working behind the counter. We exchanged friendly smiles, and he poured me a drink. As we chatted, he shared more about what he had discovered regarding David and his family. Tom revealed that David, Alice, and their mother had taken a lavish overseas trip. The trip was extravagant, filled with gambling and lavish spending, all funded by the money David had taken from me. This revelation was a shock. It was like David had used our savings to escape responsibility and indulge in luxury, leaving me to pick up the pieces. To make matters worse, David attempted to access the remaining funds I had hidden. I had given him a fake passbook to protect my savings, and thankfully, he didn't realize the money was safe from his grasp. Tom helped me confront David over the phone, demanding he repay a bar tab for Alice's drinks. David's financial troubles were worsening, and he was growing increasingly desperate. As the weeks passed, David's situation deteriorated further. Desperate for money, he borrowed from dubious sources, which led him into even deeper debt. To pay off his growing debts, David ended up working on a fishing boat, something far removed from his previous job in logistics. Alice and their mother, who had also racked up significant debts from their gambling spree, were forced to find work to repay their own debts. Meanwhile, my foster father had been closely monitoring the situation. He revealed that he had orchestrated David's financial downfall as a form of protection for me. His connections and resources were used to ensure David faced the consequences of his actions. It was a harsh but necessary step to prevent David from causing more damage. My foster father had advised me to safeguard my belongings, including my jewelry and house, which I did. With David and his family in financial disarray and the threat they once posed diminished, I felt a newfound sense of relief. My foster father's support and Tom's unexpected friendship had been crucial in navigating this tumultuous period. As I adjusted to my new life, the pain of betrayal slowly began to ease. Tom and I grew closer, and I started to see him in a new light. Despite the chaos and heartache I had endured, his kindness and honesty were a breath of fresh air. Our friendship began to blossom into something more, offering a glimpse of hope and happiness amidst the ruins of my past. The financial and emotional strain caused by David's actions had been immense, but with each passing day, I felt more equipped to face the future. I knew that despite the pain, this journey was leading me toward something better. And with Tom by my side and my foster father's unwavering support, I began to believe that a happier chapter was just around the corner. As the weeks turned into months, my life slowly began to stabilize. Returning to my foster father's home was a necessary step, but it was Tom's friendship and support that truly helped me rebuild. Our connection grew deeper, and I found comfort in his company. He was everything David was not: kind, genuine, and supportive. One evening, while we were enjoying a quiet dinner at my foster father's house, I received a call from Tom. He wanted to meet me at the bar where he worked. I agreed, knowing it would be a pleasant diversion from the routine I was getting used to. When I arrived, Tom greeted me with his usual warm smile. We found a quiet corner, away from the hustle of the bar, and started talking. Tom's presence had been a source of comfort, but there was more to discuss. "Sarah," he began, "I wanted to update you on what's been happening with David. I've been keeping an ear out, and it seems he's gotten himself into even more trouble." I listened intently, dreading what I might hear. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Tom explained that David, Alice, and their mother had gone on an extravagant overseas trip, spending recklessly on gambling and luxury. They had used the $50,000 David had taken from our savings, and it had left them deep in debt. They were living a life of excess, while I struggled to recover from their actions. Despite their lavish spending, David had been trying to get to my remaining savings. I had given him a fake passbook to protect the money, but I knew he was desperate. Tom and I had worked together to confront David over the phone, demanding that he repay a bar tab for Alice's drinks. It was a small victory, but it was symbolic of the justice I sought. The situation worsened when David borrowed money from dubious sources, falling deeper into financial trouble. His attempt to cover his debts led him to work on a fishing boat, far from the comfortable life he had once known in logistics. Meanwhile, Alice and their mother were also struggling. They had no choice but to find work to repay the debts they had accumulated during their gambling spree. It was a harsh reality for David and his family, but it felt like a small measure of justice. My foster father had used his influence to ensure that David faced consequences for his actions. The financial downfall wasn't just a punishment, it was a safeguard to ensure that David couldn't come after me or my resources any longer. Tom and I continued to grow closer, and our relationship evolved from friendship into something more profound. I could see a future with him, one that was far removed from the pain and betrayal of my past. His unwavering support and genuine affection helped heal some of the wounds left by David's deceit. One day, as Tom and I were enjoying a quiet afternoon together, my foster father sat us down for a serious conversation. He wanted to discuss the future and how he could continue to support me. His generosity had been immense, and I was grateful for everything he had done. He reminded me to protect my remaining assets and to stay vigilant. His advice was always practical and filled with wisdom. "It's important to stay smart about your finances," he said. "I've seen how people can take advantage when you're vulnerable. Keep your valuables secure and always be cautious about who you trust." His words resonated deeply. The experience with David had taught me the hard way about trust and security. I had to be cautious about my future and the people I allowed into my life. As the months passed, David's situation seemed to stabilize, though it was far from ideal. He continued working on the fishing boat, struggling to make ends meet. Alice and their mother were also working hard to repay their debts. The life they once enjoyed had been replaced with the reality of hard labor and financial strain. Meanwhile, Tom and I were building a new life together. Despite the challenges, we found solace in each other's company. We supported each other through the aftermath of my past and looked forward to a brighter future. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it was being replaced by the promise of something better. My foster father's continued support was invaluable. He had not only helped me through the immediate crisis, but had also been a source of guidance as I navigated this new chapter. With his encouragement and Tom's steadfast presence, I began to believe in the possibility of true happiness. As I looked back on everything that had transpired, I felt a mix of relief and hope. The road to recovery was still ongoing, but I was no longer facing it alone. With Tom by my side and the lessons learned from my experiences, I was ready to embrace the future with optimism. As the weeks continued to pass, life began to take on a new rhythm. Tom and I were becoming inseparable, and our relationship was growing stronger. Each day, I found myself feeling more hopeful about the future. My foster father's support had been crucial, and Tom's companionship was a source of daily joy. One evening, Tom and I were having dinner when my foster father called me into his study. I knew it was going to be an important conversation, so I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. When I entered, he was sitting at his desk with a thoughtful expression. "Sarah," he began, "I wanted to talk to you about how things have been going and offer some final advice." He went on to explain that he had been keeping a close eye on David's situation. David and his family had managed to work off some of their debt, but their financial struggles were far from over. They had been living with the consequences of their actions, and it was a harsh lesson they were learning the hard way. Tom and I had done our part to ensure David couldn't reach my savings. David had borrowed money from questionable sources, leading to even more trouble. Eventually, he had taken a job on a fishing boat, while Alice and their mother had found work to start repaying their debts. The extravagant lifestyle they had enjoyed was now a distant memory. My foster father revealed that he had orchestrated much of this to protect me. He had always been clear about the need to safeguard my assets and valuables, and his actions were meant to ensure David wouldn't be able to cause me any more harm. I was grateful for his foresight and support during this turbulent time. "You've been through so much," my foster father said with a reassuring smile. "I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled everything. You've grown so much from these experiences." I thanked him, deeply moved by his words. His support had been unwavering, and I knew that without it, my journey would have been far more difficult. The emotional and financial stability he provided was a cornerstone in my recovery. Tom and I continued to grow closer, and it became clear that we were building something meaningful. One day, while we were walking through a park, Tom turned to me with a serious look in his eyes. He took my hand and said, "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about us. I want you to know that I care about you deeply and want to build a future together." His words filled me with joy. I realized that despite the pain of the past, I had found someone who truly valued me. Our relationship was a beacon of hope and love in my life. In a final twist, Tom's support and my foster father's guidance proved to be pivotal. My foster father had always admired Tom and was supportive of our relationship. His approval meant a lot to both of us. As Tom and I discussed our future, we decided to take things step by step, enjoying each moment and building a life based on trust and mutual respect. Looking back, I could see how much I had learned from this journey. The betrayal and challenges had led me to discover my own strength and resilience. The importance of loyalty and friendship had been reinforced, and I felt more equipped to face whatever came next. The financial troubles caused by David's actions had been substantial. He had misused $50,000 of our savings, and his debts had led him to borrow from dubious sources. His attempts to cover his tracks had only resulted in more hardship for him and his family. Meanwhile, I had safeguarded my remaining money with the fake passbook and ensured that David couldn't access it. With Tom by my side and my foster father's continued support, I was ready to embrace a future filled with hope and possibility. The road to happiness was not without its bumps, but I had learned valuable lessons along the way. My story was one of overcoming adversity and finding true happiness after betrayal. As Tom and I looked toward the future, we knew that our journey together would be filled with new experiences and challenges. But we faced it with a shared sense of purpose and optimism. With the past behind us and a bright future ahead, we were ready to build a life filled with love and joy.
To Grace. My mom's voice rang out over the room, a beaming smile on her face as she lifted her glass. The one who made this magical day happen. I couldn't have done it without you. I froze in my seat, the words slamming into me like a brick wall. Applause erupted around me, the room filled with laughter and cheers as Grace, sitting just a few seats away, gave a modest little smile and nodded graciously. My name is Anna Clark. I'm 30 years old, and up until recently, I thought I had a pretty solid relationship with my mom. We used to be close, movie nights, long talks over coffee, a real bond. But everything changed when she started dating her now husband, Mark. Slowly, I felt her pulling away, replacing me with Grace, her new stepdaughter, who was younger, prettier, and seemingly flawless in every way. This wedding, her wedding, was supposed to be my way of reconnecting with her, of proving that I still mattered. I'd spent months planning every detail, silently footing the bill for everything from the venue to the flowers. But it was all a secret, at her insistence, to keep the magic alive. And now, here I was, invisible, as she gave all the credit to someone who barely lifted a finger. The months leading up to the wedding had been a whirlwind of work, stress, and quiet sacrifices. Mom hadn't been involved in the planning at all. That was her decision. "Anna, I don't want to get wrapped up in the stress of it all," she'd said early on. "You're so much better at this kind of thing. Just surprise me, okay? I know you'll make it perfect." Her trust, though flattering, felt strange. She never asked me about the progress, no questions about the flowers, the venue, or even the dress code. It left me confused, but I told myself she was just excited to enjoy the surprise on her big day. I worked tirelessly, managing every detail, from securing the venue to designing the seating chart. I poured my heart into it, convincing myself that this would bring us closer again. What I didn't know, what I only realized too late, was that Grace had been telling Mom a different story. Behind the scenes, Grace had been claiming credit for the entire wedding planning process. I didn't understand why Mom never brought up the preparations to me, why she never seemed curious or concerned about how things were going. Now looking back, the pieces fit. Grace had made sure Mom believed she was the one making it all happen. I didn't see it then, caught up in the work and my hope for the perfect day. I thought Mom's distance was just her way of letting me take the reins. I never imagined it was because she thought someone else was holding them. I remembered a strange conversation I had overheard a few weeks before the wedding. Mom and Grace were sitting in the living room while I was in the kitchen, jotting down notes for the guest list. Their voices carried just loud enough for me to catch snippets. "Oh, Grace, you've been such a lifesaver with all this wedding planning," Mom said, her voice warm and appreciative. "I honestly don't know how I'd have managed without you." Grace laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that grated once you realized how fake it was. "Oh, it's nothing really," she said. "I just want your day to be perfect. You deserve it." My pen froze mid-note, the words making my stomach twist. What was Mom talking about? Grace hadn't been involved in the wedding at all, at least not that I'd seen. But before I could think too much about it, Mom's voice softened further. "I'm so lucky to have a stepdaughter like you," she said. "You're such a natural at this. I thought that Anna was handling it, but you're probably much better than her at it, of course." My throat tightened as I stood there, the conversation echoing in my mind. I wanted to walk in and ask what they were talking about, but I stopped myself. Maybe Mom was just being polite, or maybe Grace was helping in some small way I wasn't aware of. I told myself it didn't matter. But now, sitting here at the reception, her words made all too much sense. Grace had planted those seeds, and Mom had swallowed the narrative whole. The weeks leading up to the wedding were grueling. Every spare moment was consumed by spreadsheets, emails, and endless phone calls. I worked late into the night most days, juggling my regular job with the ever-growing list of wedding tasks. My desk became a chaotic mess of vendor contracts, swatches of fabric for the table linens, and color-coded seating charts. There was the day the florist called to tell me the flowers Mom wanted weren't in season, and I had to scour local suppliers to find a replacement. Then there was the venue mix-up, when the hall booked for the reception accidentally double-scheduled us with a corporate event. I spent hours on the phone smoothing things over, eventually securing the perfect space, though it cost more than I'd budgeted. I coordinated the catering, choosing a menu I knew Mom would love, and even paid extra for a tasting session to make sure it was just right. I handpicked the decorations, spent hours folding and tying ribbons for the chairs, and painstakingly designed the invitations myself to save money. All of this was done in secret, just as Mom had asked. "I want it to be a surprise," she'd said. But the surprise came at a cost. Late nights, skipped meals, and a painful dent in my savings. I had put my whole heart into making it perfect for her, telling myself it was worth it to see her smile on the big day. And now, sitting at the reception, it was clear I'd been invisible the whole time. The sound of a fork tapping against a glass silenced the chatter in the reception hall. I looked up to see Mom standing at the head table, a radiant smile lighting up her face as she held her glass aloft. The room quieted in anticipation. "I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here today," she began, her voice warm and filled with emotion. "This day has been a dream come true for me, and I'm so grateful to share it with all of you." Her eyes scanned the room, briefly meeting mine, before moving on. Planning a wedding is no small task, and I have to admit I wasn't involved in much of it. But thankfully, I had someone who stepped in and made this day as perfect as it is. My heart swelled for just a moment, foolishly hoping she meant me. "Grace," Mom continued, her voice brimming with pride, "you've been my rock through this whole process. You've been there every step of the way, making sure every detail was perfect. I couldn't have done this without you." The room erupted into applause, heads turning toward Grace, who gave a bashful smile and waved lightly, like the gracious heroine in some story only she seemed to know. "I'm so lucky to have you as my stepdaughter," Mom said, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. "You've made this day magical, and I'll never forget everything you've done for me." The applause grew louder, and tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as the weight of her words settled in. Not one mention of me, not even a nod in my direction. I sat frozen in my seat, forcing a smile as my chest tightened painfully. Grace beamed under the attention, her eyes flickering to mine for the briefest moment, a subtle smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart pounding in my chest as the applause for Grace roared around the room. My cheeks burned, and I swallowed hard, willing the tears to stay hidden. This wasn't the time. This wasn't the place. Looking at Mom, glowing with happiness, and Grace, soaking up the admiration, I felt a storm of emotions: anger, sadness, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. But I also knew that saying anything now would only make things worse. This was her day, her wedding. No matter how much it hurt, I couldn't bring myself to ruin it. I forced a smile and joined in the polite clapping, though it felt like my hands weighed a ton. I kept my gaze down and my face neutral, determined not to let anyone see how much I was unraveling inside. I told myself I'd deal with it later, process it, confront it if I had to. But not now. Not here. For the rest of the evening, I stayed quiet, blending into the background as much as possible, waiting for the night to finally end. A week after the wedding, when Mom returned from her honeymoon, I decided I couldn't hold it in any longer. The betrayal had been simmering in my chest, growing heavier with each passing day. I went over to her house and found her unpacking suitcases in the living room, her face still glowing from the vacation. "Mom," I started, my voice sharper than I intended. "We need to talk." She looked up, her smile faltering at my tone. "What is it, Anna? You don't look happy to see me." I crossed my arms, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "What the heck was that? At the wedding? I was the one who did everything for you, and you stood up there and gave all the credit to Grace. She didn't do a single thing." Mom's face hardened, the warmth in her eyes vanishing. "Anna," she said, her voice icy, "I don't know what's gotten into you, but this jealousy of Grace is unbecoming. She worked so hard to make that day special for me. She was the one who actually cared about me." My jaw dropped, my stomach twisting into knots. "Jealousy? Mom, I'm not jealous. Grace lied to you. She didn't plan anything. I did. Every flower arrangement, every table, every vendor, I was the one who made it all happen." Mom let out a dismissive laugh, shaking her head. "Stop it, Anna. I asked you to handle the planning, but you clearly didn't care enough to follow through. Grace stepped in because she knew how important this day was to me. She's the one who made it perfect, not you." I stared at her, disbelief flooding through me. "She lied to you, Mom. She didn't do anything. She just took credit for all my work, and you believed her without even asking me about it?" She crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "Grace wouldn't lie to me, Anna. You're just upset because she outshone you, and frankly, that's on you." Her words hit me like a slap, and I felt the tears rising despite my best efforts to stay composed. "You're wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "And one day, you'll see that." But she turned away, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "I think you should leave, Anna. I won't stand here and listen to you badmouth Grace." I walked out, my chest aching, the door slamming behind me. Her blind loyalty to Grace stung more than anything I could have imagined. She had chosen Grace's lie over my truth, and I didn't know how, or if I could ever fix that. The next day I couldn't let it go. The anger and betrayal bubbling inside me pushed me to do what I'd been avoiding. I went to Grace's apartment. When she opened the door, her face lit up with that saccharine smile she always wore, as if she hadn't turned my life upside down. "Anna," she chirped, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What a surprise. What brings you here?" I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "Sure, come on in," she said with a cheerful tone, stepping aside. I walked past her into the pristine living room, the scent of her overly sweet perfume lingering in the air. I turned to face her, not bothering with pleasantries. "What the heck, Grace? Why did you tell my mom that you planned her wedding?" Her smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or just irritation. "What are you talking about?" she said, feigning confusion. "Don't play dumb," I snapped, my voice rising. "You told her you planned the wedding. You let her believe you did everything when it was all me. Do you have any idea how hard I worked? How much I sacrificed to make it perfect?" Grace laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Anna, I never told her anything like that. She just assumed I was helping. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't correct her." I glared at her, my blood boiling. "Didn't correct her? You sat there at the reception and soaked up all the credit. You let her believe it was you while she completely ignored me." She crossed her arms, her smile turning smug. "Look, it's not my fault she believes in me more than you. Maybe if you'd been a little more open about what you were doing, this wouldn't have happened." Her words hit like a slap, and I took a step closer, my voice trembling with fury. "You're unbelievable. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you didn't care. All you wanted was the spotlight." Grace shrugged, her expression cool and detached. "If it means that much to you, talk to her. It's not my problem if she thinks I'm better at these things than you are." I stared at her, disbelief and disgust flooding through me. "You're pathetic, Grace," I said, my voice low. "And one way or another, the truth is going to come out. Enjoy the spotlight while you can." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved with a mix of anger and resolve. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. Grace wasn't going to get away with this. The day of Grace's birthday arrived, and I sat at home stewing, knowing full well I hadn't been invited. I'd heard from my brother that it was going to be a big celebration. Grace's friends, her boyfriend Liam, and even my mom and the rest of the family would be there. The thought of them all laughing and celebrating while Grace basked in the attention made my blood boil. I stared at the folder on the table in front of me, packed with receipts, email chains, and text messages, every piece of evidence proving that I had been the one to plan and pay for Mom's wedding. Grace's lies had stolen my effort, my recognition, and my relationship with Mom. And I'd had enough. I grabbed the folder, threw on a coat, and headed out the door. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. Before I showed up, the room was buzzing with admiration for Grace. Laughter echoed through the space as her friends and family circled her, their voices overlapping with compliments. "You really outdid yourself with that wedding, Grace," one of her friends gushed, holding a glass of champagne. "Everything was so elegant. It looked like something out of a magazine." Another chimed in, "The floral arrangements were breathtaking. You have such an eye for detail." Even Mom couldn't hold back her adoration. "I don't know how you managed it all," she said, beaming at Grace. "You made it perfect, just like I knew you would." Grace basked in the attention, smiling sweetly and nodding modestly, her eyes glinting with satisfaction as she soaked up the praise for work she hadn't done. When I arrived at Grace's apartment, the party was in full swing. Laughter spilled out into the hallway as I stood at the door, taking one last deep breath before knocking. The noise quieted, and a moment later Grace opened the door. Her smile froze when she saw me. "Anna," she said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "Crashing the party," I said evenly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The room fell silent as I walked in, all eyes turning toward me. Mom was sitting on the couch, a drink in hand, while Grace's boyfriend Liam stood near the cake, looking confused. "Everyone," I began, my voice loud and steady. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something I need to say." Grace closed the door and turned to me, her face pale. "Anna, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I cut her off, my gaze sweeping the room. "For weeks now, I've been watching someone else take credit for everything I did to plan my mom's wedding. And I think it's time everyone knows the truth." A murmur went through the crowd as I opened the folder and pulled out the first stack of receipts. "I was the one who booked the venue," I said, holding up the contract with my name on it. "I hired the caterers, chose the menu, and paid for every single dish served that night." I moved to the next pile. "I picked out the flowers, organized the centerpieces, and coordinated the delivery times." Here's the invoice and the email chain confirming it. My voice grew stronger as I continued, laying out the text messages, spreadsheets, and more. Everything, the invitations, the decorations, the seating arrangements, was done by me, not Grace. The room was dead silent now, the weight of my words settling over everyone. Mom's face was frozen in shock, and Grace stood stiffly near the door, her jaw clenched. "Anna," Mom finally said, her voice wavering, "what are you talking about? Grace told me." "Grace lied," I said, cutting her off as I turned to face Grace. "Go on, Grace. Tell everyone how you let her believe you did all the work. Tell them how you stood there at the reception and took credit for things you had nothing to do with." Grace's lips parted, but no words came out. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. "It's not like that," she stammered, her voice shaky. I didn't lie, I didn't correct her because it wasn't a big deal." "Not a big deal," I said, my voice rising. "You let me work myself to exhaustion while you stood there and soaked up the praise. You didn't care about what that would do to me, or to Mom." Liam stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "Grace," he said slowly, "is this true? Did you lie about planning the wedding?" Grace turned to him, her eyes wide. "Liam, I..." "Don't," he said, holding up a hand. "Just tell me the truth." She looked around the room, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Fine," she said finally, her voice bitter. "Yes, okay? I didn't plan the wedding. Anna did, but it's not like it matters. It was just one day." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Liam's face hardened, and he took a step back from her. "It matters to me," he said coldly. "If you can lie about something like this, what else are you lying about?" He shook his head, his voice filled with disbelief. "I can't do this anymore, Grace. We're done." Grace's mouth fell open, but no words came out. The color drained from her face as she watched Liam grab his coat and leave. I turned to Mom, who was sitting frozen, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I tried to tell you," I said softly. "I did everything for you, and you wouldn't even listen to me." "Anna," she said, her voice breaking, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I should have asked, I should have." "It's too late for that," I said, my tone firm but not unkind. "I just needed you to know the truth, and now you do." With that, I gathered my things and walked out, leaving the party in stunned silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. A couple of days later, the phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced at the screen, surprised to see Grace's father's name. Mark wasn't the type to call. He was always quiet, keeping to himself at family gatherings. Hesitating for a moment, I answered. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Anna," his deep voice came through, slow and deliberate. "It's Mark. I hope I'm not bothering you." "No, it's fine," I replied, unsure of where this was going. "What's on your mind?" There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he sighed. "I just wanted to apologize," he said, his voice thick with shame, "for what happened, for what Grace did." My chest tightened, but I kept my voice calm. "You don't have to apologize for her, Mark. It wasn't your fault." "I know," he said quickly. "But still, I feel responsible. I raised her better than that, or at least I thought I did." He paused again, struggling to find the right words. "At the party, when I found out what she did, taking credit for all your work, I was ashamed, Anna. Terribly ashamed. You didn't deserve that." I swallowed hard, his sincerity catching me off guard. "Thank you for saying that," I said softly. "It means a lot." "She's paying the price now," Mark continued, his tone somber. "I think she's starting to understand the damage she's done. But that doesn't fix what you went through. If there's anything I can do to make it right, Anything at all. Just say the word. I exhaled, the weight of his words settling over me. I appreciate that, Mark, I said after a moment. I really do. But I think the best thing you can do is talk to Grace. Help her see why this wasn't okay. I will, he said firmly. I promise, Anna. And again, I'm sorry. For all of it. Thank you, I said, my voice steady but filled with gratitude. That means more than you know. In the weeks following Grace's birthday, things shifted. Mom reached out several times, apologizing profusely for not believing me, and for the way she had dismissed my efforts. Her words were filled with regret, and though I accepted her apology, I made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time. Grace, on the other hand, had become a shadow of her former self. The admiration she had once basked in was gone, replaced by awkward silence and judgmental stares from friends and family who now saw her for who she truly was. Liam never came back, and from what I heard, Grace hadn't taken the breakup well. As for me, I felt lighter. For so long I had sought validation from people who didn't value me, but now I realized I didn't need their approval to feel worthy. I channeled my energy into myself, picking up hobbies I'd neglected, reconnecting with friends, and setting boundaries that protected my peace. Mom and I eventually began to repair our relationship, but it was different now. I no longer bent over backward to prove myself, and she seemed to genuinely respect the space I needed. The distance allowed us to rebuild something healthier, something that wasn't built on my sacrifices. As for Grace, she faded from the center of attention, and I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. But only a little. Sometimes, the truth had a way of setting things right. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally move forward.